that's online. I'm looking at my other screen, so I hope you understand where I'm looking. I'd love to hear from everyone online where you're dialing in from and why you wanted to come onto this webinar. So type it in the chat. We're going to try and have some discussion as well. So later on, we'll talk about how you might unmute and speak as well. Looks like people are typing. Really, I'm not too sure where people are dialing in from or why you are doing that, but I've heard a few people say, here we go, we've got some comments, want to support the work, become a better person, and JCI UK, that's awesome. I was really looking forward to joining your event if I can, if the time zones align. Waiting for this topic and need to do active anti-racism work. That's awesome. Be a better advocate from Scotland. That's really great. I've run this talk and webinar a couple of times, and we really hear that everyone's really interested in this topic, but also really interested in themselves and understanding what they could be doing better. Josie from Germany, being better myself and listening to me after Tallinn. That's great, Josie. Laga, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, from Iceland, an important topic. Maria from Frankfurt, Germany, and do unconscious bias and subconscious racism work. Welcome. Petru from JCI Romania, welcome. So I'm going to dive in. The way this presentation works generally is that we try and keep it quite interactive. We might have some technical issues in getting people to speak, so we'll try that. And if it doesn't work, I'd really appreciate if you could just keep typing in the chat, keep interacting, because it is a collective learning. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say, oh, that's dropped off. So let me bring up my slides so that I know what we're talking to. So the first thing I wanted to say is let's create a safe space here together. We can see that each of us have joined because we're wanting to learn, we're wanting to be better. And so I just want to touch on that a little bit and say we are here willingly. We're here because we're open-minded, wanting to learn from each other, wanting to learn about ourselves. This is I want this webinar to be quite a safe space where you can ask those questions that might sound uncomfortable, that might not necessarily be acceptable, or you might not feel it's acceptable to ask in any other space. Feel free to ask. Oh wow, kia ora, Dominic. It's really lovely to have you. And yeah, all the way from Ireland as well. Couple of other things. You may leave and return at any time because these are some heavy topics, and it lands differently for everyone. This workshop is recorded, so if you have any issues with that, let Raiki or Swava know, and they might be able to help with that. As it is recorded and it might be shared, just be aware of any stories that you do share, but we can all learn from each other, so let's keep that in mind. One last thing that I really want to touch on is that anti-racism work, and especially being an active ally, and our own work, even for myself, and understanding my biases, where I come from and how I approach people, that is a journey, and everyone is in a different stage in their journey, so it's totally fine to be where you're at, and we're going to dive into a few topics, discuss that a little bit, see how we can learn from each other, and hopefully by the end of the hour and a half we can have a few tools that we might be able to use actively. Welcome, Kristen from JCR Ireland as well. All right, how does that sound to everyone? Does that sound all right to keep going? Do you have any questions? No? Okay, in that case, I'm going to keep going. So before we do keep going, this workshop is not a certification. It's not something that you do because you have made a mistake and you want to present this workshop as, hey, look, I went to this workshop hosted by JCI Europe and a trainer, and therefore I'm not racist, or I'm qualified and I can tick the box of being an anti-racist. Like I said, it is ongoing work. So please don't present it that way. The workshop is also not representing anyone's employer or giving legal advice. And I just want to say this workshop, if there are people who are on here that attended my first workshop either in Tallinn or a couple earlier this year, this workshop is a little bit of a step forward because that one was more about awareness and understanding allyship and some actions and tools that you could do. This workshop is a bit deeper. So I would really like this workshop not to be a place where we discuss whether the racism is real. We discuss whether oppression exists. I understand from everyone's comments that everyone is here because they want to be better and dive into this topic. So that's not something I'm going to touch on, and I hope that's all right with everyone. So before I keep going, you might be wondering who I am. So I just wanted to introduce myself quickly. As I mentioned, my name is Nurain Janah. If you would like to say my name properly, it's Nurain. It is an Arabic pronunciation, and that is my active work to actually present myself the way that I do. And that's something that you might be keeping in your anti-racism toolbox, is learn how to say other people's names. Obviously, I cannot hear people at the moment, so I'm really apologizing for all the names I might be saying incorrectly, but it is something that I really keep in mind because it means a lot when your name is said correctly, and it is such an act of inclusivity. So I am currently a committee member assigned for Europe within the JCI Advocacy Committee, along with Adelaide from Switzerland. I served as the 2018 National President for JCI New Zealand. As a day job, I work as a senior consultant at one of the big four accounting firms, completely different to the work that we're talking about today. I also speak and facilitate like I am doing today, and I founded a social enterprise, Authenticity Aotearoa, which works to empower women from migrant and ethnic backgrounds here in New Zealand. So I hope that gives you some comfort that I know somewhat of what I'm talking about, and do feel free to connect with me afterwards. So I just want to ask a question. What do you think perspective is? I'm just going to move to a blank slide. What do you think perspective means to you? In any context, what is perspective? Type in the chat. If you would like to speak, please indicate to Raiki and Svava, and they might be able to unmute you or allow you to speak. So the question is, what is perspective? Hi, Mark, welcome. Nice to see you here. Svava, your worldview, your location from which you look at things. That's great. Valerie, a way of viewing things. Samantha, your experience. Josie, a certain view on a topic or issue. That's all great. Exactly right. Now let me ask you, if you're defining perspective this way, how do you shift your perspective? Say you know, as some of you have pointed out, it's your experience that colors your perspective. How do you shift it? Rachel, by education. Oh, that's interesting. What kind of education? Looking at the situation from another person's view. Mark, that's great. Jen, learning about other people's lives. Exactly. Petru, that's great. What you've said there about opening up to other perspectives, that open-mindedness, particularly in anti-racism work, is really important because I'm going to be honest, it's uncomfortable. So you really have to lean into that. Jen, try to be empathetic. Yeah, that's right. Rachel, reading up on information. Reiki, by hearing how others see things. Reiki, that's a really good one that I want to pick up on, and that's you've kind of touched on exactly where I was going with that. Knowing that mine is the right one. When we talk about the ability to be open-minded, the ability to move your perspective, one of the things that we talk about is having the ability to hold two things as true at the same time. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of those comments. I think those are really great. Dominic, that's an interesting one where we talk about the experience, and we're going to talk a little bit deeper about that in a minute. So what I was talking about was that how the ability to hold two truths at the same time. So I know that my experience personally is colored by the fact that I am a 1.5 generation New Zealander, which means that I moved here when I was younger, but I still really hold my culture really close to me. I speak another, my mother tongue, and so I kind of hold two cultures at the same time. It's very similar where I can then go to another person and look at their experience and hold that as true in my mind. So it is quite interesting to think about that. The reason I raise the idea of perspective today and not, and so removed from the anti-racism concept is because being an active ally, an active, authentic ally, and being and doing anti-racist work has a lot to do with your ability to shift perspective and your ability to, be quite self-compassionate and forgiving. So a couple of tools that I have got here that I'll touch on how we shift our perspective, and they have been touched on by everyone in your comments, is we have to notice our perspective. And not only do you notice your perspective, you have to notice what you're telling yourself. If you are in a situation, say, where you notice someone isn't being as inclusive as they could be, say, or you notice that, if I was to take a gender example, you notice that if you're not a woman, you notice that the only other woman in the room is being asked to do your office housework, get your cups of tea, even though they are not. That's not their job. You can notice that and notice where you are in the room, how much power you have, and then moving on to acceptance around how you're feeling. So say you've said that, because of your experience or your unconscious bias. Say you've just asked someone to do something that's not their job, and you're noticing that that is a microaggression or that is something that is coming from your unconscious bias. One of the most important things that you can do in that moment is notice it and accept it, because that self-compassion is the key to moving your perspective to then asking the question about where did it come from and how can I be better? And I think all of the attendees that have joined us for this webinar today, you've already noticed that you want to do better and you are inquiring about what to do next. So keep these 4 steps in mind. I call it the nice steps to shift your perspective while we go through it. So the next bit, we're going to try this. I'm not too sure how the technical issues are going to work here because I wanted to play a little clip. And this is from New Zealand's Human Rights Commission. They've recently launched a project where it's called the Voices of Racism. It is quite confronting. So if you are feeling a bit sensitive or if you have experienced racism, you might want to switch off for a bit here. But I will try and play this now. Just one minute. Let me know if you can hear that.
You all eat pies. You love pies.
Excuse me. I just need to check your pockets.
All that stuff happened ages ago. Let it go.
It might be served by someone else.
This cultural stuff is wasting time.
I can't pronounce this name.
Before I take you through, are you aware of the level of real estate in this area?
Read the sign, or can't you read English?
They're watching you closely because you can't be trusted.
Oh, sorry, Swava. I didn't do that, but I hope that's all right. I will do it next time. But could people hear some of that? So I'd love to hear what you thought or what your experience was hearing that. Yeah, just let me know if you did hear some of the words or, yeah, Swava, considering that you were never asked that exactly. Prejudices against people, yeah. Yeah, it's quite an interesting campaign that the Human Rights Commission has launched just a week ago, and that's taking real experiences that are reported to the Human Rights Commission, and they've translated into a voice of racism. And I guess it is quite confronting to hear that those are things that people do say. Shows a lack of understanding, the typical notions of people having problems with unusual names. Yep, exactly right. While I go into the next one, I'd love to hear what it made you think of, or whether it made you feel driven to do anything, or did you feel like if you were in that situation, you could do something, or you knew what you might do? Okay, I will keep going with some of the material here, but there are some questions shortly, so I'd really love to kind of hear your thoughts and shift our perspective together. And the sun is rising, so hopefully we can kind of get a little bit more of energy in this chat, so please do keep sharing what your perspective is. What is anti-racism? And you will have heard after the Black Lives Matter movement started this year around the campaigns of George Floyd and really so many incidents that have happened in the US and really around the world, how I guess the quotes that have come up and a lot of the material that have come up. So I really love this quote: "To be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness." And Dominic, you've exactly got it. It is, bias is the art of not knowing. And I just want to stay there on that quote and Dominic's well-timed comment there. It is a sign of privilege not to have to, I guess, be an active ally. It is a sign of privilege if you're not practicing anti-racism, because for me, I am very privileged in that I have a university education. I was obviously, as a migrant, able to move here. English is my first language, for example. Both my parents have an education. So acknowledging my privilege, but also understanding where in a society like New Zealand I am a minority and marginalized, still means that I have to be constantly aware of racism and microaggressions. And that means that I am a lot more aware of the work that I could be doing to make spaces and organizations, and even individually within my friendships, make all of those spaces more inclusive and make sure that I'm doing anti-racist work. So if you're thinking about anti-racist work, but it's not something that you think about unless it's, right in your face as the hashtag trending on Instagram or social media, then you might want to look at that and understand what it is that you're missing and where your privilege stands in terms of the ability to ignore it on a day-to-day basis. And that is one of the key things that I'd love you to take away and think about is how much are you thinking about this work on a daily basis? And if you're thinking about it 5 minutes a day, or maybe it occurs to you a couple of times a week, think about the privilege that you have and how much it doesn't take up within your life, either time, emotional energy, or even just having to deal with overtly racist acts like some of what you heard on that video. My internet is a bit unstable at the moment, so if I do cut out, I apologize, but please let me know if you are hearing me all right. Great, wonderful, thank you for that. So keeping on this idea of anti-racism, I just want to highlight anti-racism is different from allyship. Allyship talks about, I guess, in situations where you have equal power, that you can step up and speak up. It's moving beyond the bystander effect, where if you see something happening, you are able to speak up and actually challenge the situation. Anti-racism goes beyond the situation. It is an active process of work on yourself, on the systems that surround you, on the communities that surround you, and continuing to do that work. So the work we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but it is touching on 3 different levels, and it is a constant process for myself as well. Does anyone have any questions about that definition? Do you have any thoughts and ideas of what you thought to expect here or what you wanted to know? So while you're typing that answer, I also want to pick up on another piece of anti-racism, is that it's someone who works to become aware of the levels or spheres of racism and then makes it their job or their own responsibility for that education. I often have been really frustrated, and especially in this year where we've had this moment of having conversations around race, having conversations about how much history is wrapped up in racism and how much structure is wrapped up in racism. And I've been really frustrated because I am known as an anti-racism educator, but at the same time I experience racism, and I can imagine that there are people with less privilege who experience more racism. And over that time, just to share my experience, my Messenger and my Instagram and my LinkedIn was flooded with requests, not for paid work, but requests on questions that they thought I could answer, and in the middle of my workday or whenever, just to say, hey, Nurain, I know that you talk about this, or you are a minority because you identify as a Muslim woman of color. Can you tell me about what that experience is and what can I do better? Hey, I've got this question about defining anti-racism and what we can do. Hey, I did something wrong. I won't share the story because it might be identifiable, but hey, I did this thing today that was really not correct. How do I correct myself? And it's just been really frustrating if you look at it from the lens that if you're thinking about yourself as an ally, and these are good friends or colleagues or acquaintances who I know mean really well, and I know that their heart is in the right place. But thank you, Raiki. That's a great question. I'll come to that in a minute. If you think about the emotional burden of me then having to living in this moment of where we're having this conversation about racism constantly, it is really confronting for me, because I know that I will go into my workplace, although my workplace is a lot better than other workplaces that I have been, but I might go into my workplace and there are people who are less aware and they don't even know that it is a microaggression. I might walk into a meeting and someone might immediately, even though they're hearing my rather Kiwi accent, even though they can see that I have been invited to this meeting, that it's just a work meeting, their first question is, where are you from? And so I guess what I'm saying in response to your question, Raiki, about how do I feel about people asking me these questions is, we are in the age of internet and there are so many resources out there. So before you come and ask me as a solution to your problems, is like, oh, there's my marginalized friend and she can tell me all about how to be a better human. It's taking responsibility for our own education. I do that constantly. I make sure that I am, tuned into the people that I follow, the authors that I read, the TV shows that I tune into. I make sure that it is a perspective that I don't have. I make sure that I am responsible for my own education. And there's some great comments here. Mark, you've been really fortunate to travel the world and experience amazing people and different cultures. That's a great way of education. Dominic, racism can be caused by a lack of understanding and that we perceive as our culture, part of a shared culture. That's such a great point. Swava, asking marginalized groups of people to do our emotional unpaid labor. Exactly right. And, I do put myself out there as an anti-racism educator, but what I'd really love you all, when you come to the end of this, to have the perspective that we're each responsible, wherever we sit on that, on the ability to have privilege or not in any context, we're each responsible for our own education, our own understanding of other people and other cultures. So absolutely seek out travel. Look at how diverse your friend group is. I noticed it recently when I launched a social media campaign around the lockdown here in New Zealand and sharing experiences. I noticed how privileged my friend group was, and I've gone out of my way to kind of question that and think about, obviously I have gone to university, I work in a corporate job, but why is it that I'm just kind of stuck in that space where I'm not listening to other groups and I'm not welcoming different professionals, who are artists or, musicians, etc. As a really simple example, why am I not having those groups of people within my circle of friends, and really questioning that? It does take time and it does take work to reach out and open your mind to that, but it can be as simple as making sure that the people that you're surrounded by don't just think the same as you, because then you all have the same perspective and you get stuck and it becomes really difficult to be so flexible. How does all of that land for you? What thoughts are coming up? What questions are coming up? What challenges are coming up? I'm very happy to be challenged. That's why I said this is a safe space, and also being very open that I am also on a journey. This is very much a learning journey for me too, because I don't think anti-racism work ends. So please do share what's coming up for you here. As you're typing, I will go on. If you do want to speak as well, let Raiki know, because I'd love to hear your voices. Just hearing myself echoing in the room at this early in the morning in New Zealand. So please do let us know if you want to speak and have a bit of a discussion. So more theory. I'd love to touch on this diagram. I'm sure you've seen versions of this before, but this is a really simplified version where we talk about the structure of racism. we've talked a little bit about the individual piece around being responsible for our own education, our emotional unpaid labour, as Suava very well put it. And then we haven't too much talked about the institutional and the structural piece. But moving from the individual action to the institutional and structural piece, for me, is what anti-racism work is about. Because you can be well-meaning, and you can, put up your Black Lives Matter post on social media, and you can be nice to your friends who may or may not be very diverse. But if we're thinking about active anti-racist work, it's really about challenging those institutions and structures that keep those inequalities in place. So we've defined anti-racism and talked about the power imbalances and really challenging the way that we see the world. There is also centering that historical context, and Dominic might be in a better place than me to speak about this, but I'll give it a go. And Dominic, you might be able to add from a Te Ao Māori worldview and Indigenous worldview. But the institutional and structural piece, one of the biggest things that I go to in New Zealand is the acknowledgement of land and people, our First Nations, wherever that applies to, and it may not to a number of places in Europe, I know, but a number of places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other places I know that applies to, and it's that deeper, in the US, it's that deeper acknowledgement that you have to make that there are historical and intergenerational trauma that has occurred, and that's the first step for me moving into the institutional and structural space where we talk about anti-racism. I'm just going to pause there a minute because there's a couple of comments here on the previous one. Suava, it's hard to make friends outside your group if you're seldom in the same surroundings. That is a great point. Jen, when I think about this in Germany, I feel like there is no awareness of structural racism at all. Racism in Germany means Nazi Germany, something everybody knows is wrong and wants to distance themselves from. That's such an interesting point. I really love that. To your point, Suava, I think that probably resonates with a lot of people that are listening in, and absolutely, even for myself. It's really difficult because the spaces that I occupy is the corporate world. I have recently been working probably a 12-hour day more than an 8-hour day. And so the people I'm surrounded by are very similar to me. They have had the privilege to be able to come and work in a profession like that. What I like to think about and challenging myself to make friends outside the group is I do this thing. This is going to sound really weird and possibly creepy, but here we go. I like to every 2 weeks have a look through my LinkedIn or Instagram. If it's Instagram, I'll see if someone new has followed me or found me somehow, or I'll actively seek out some anti-racism tags or even inclusion tags, empowerment tags like women of color, for example, and search up some young women or some champions who are nearby that I don't have in my circle and reach out. I dropped an Instagram message to a random young woman who is an amazing champion of equality, and we are in the same city, and I just never connected the dots because we work in entirely different professions. It is uncomfortable. It takes time, but it is really incredibly rewarding. I've really, walked in those spaces, look for networking events around here to go and, really disrupt my thinking. If you're brave enough, try that, because we are in this digital lockdown world at the moment, and people might be more open to having a virtual coffee with you. So that's something possibly fun that you could do. What do I propose on those messages? Do you just start talking, or do you ask for a coffee together? Yeah, good point. I don't recommend reaching out because you're looking for someone to do emotional labor, again, just to make that point clear. I recommend reaching out because you feel like you have an interest in common, and just saying, hey, I noticed this interest that we have in common, or I noticed that you do this and I'd love to learn more about this. And that's a great way to do that. Like primary school and finding people who have things in common. It's really going back to those basics, because as adults, we really get stuck in the, we've got our little friend group and that's all we have, and that's the people that we've known. So really disrupt that perspective that you have. Petra, it sounds like that's resonating with you, so let me know how you go with that. Jen, I'll stay with your one really quickly, but we are going to dive into that a little bit deeper in a minute too. I think about and because we're on the slide of structure of racism, I think about the overt racism. And you heard some of the overt racism on that little clip that I shared on the Voice of Racism and from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, where people can be overtly racist. You know, it's shouting insults while you're on the street, for example. Or, you know, go back to where you came from type stuff. Some of the really quite horrendous racism that I've heard from my friends over this lockdown, because they are from, you know, they present as from Asian origin, and so some of the racist encounters they've had on the street, those are what we think about when we say racism. And one of the key takeaways that I'd really love you to have from this discussion is that that is, I guess, if you think about racism as an iceberg, I don't have that diagram on me on this presentation, but if you think about racism as an iceberg, you've got all the structures. So you've got, as you see in this pyramid, you've got the structural piece where it's already inbuilt into the system that people are discriminated against. You know, it's well known in New Zealand, and I think in other parts of the world as well. If you have a name that's difficult to pronounce in English on your CV, for example, people will dismiss that quicker. I saw a story recently where I believe it was another Human Rights Commission campaign here, where a Māori woman had applied to rent a home, and because of their name, they got declined. And one of their friends or family suggested they use an English name or a Pākehā name. And really interesting, what happened there was the moment that she used a name for the same property, she was told that she could, you know, come and view the property, for example, the property was still available. So those are the kinds of things that, in that case, she became aware of it, but you might not become aware of it ever, because you are just living in this structural system where people discriminate, but you can't name it, I suppose. So touching on the idea that Jen's raised, that there's no awareness of structural racism at all, it's really challenging those kinds of things and understanding. It does take understanding of the experiences as well. Dominic, Ireland is an interesting spot in which Irish people have individual identities by county area, but also the depths of understanding of Irish culture, religion, sport, and community identity. For example, a member of the travelling community. That's such a great point. I'd love to hear more about that, because we had an incident in New Zealand a couple of years ago where you know, people were being quite discriminatory towards. They ended up not being a member of the travelling community, but that was, the media just really raised that point. Mark, how's the problem of racism at the moment in New Zealand? On my visit, you were amazed to see Māori culture was integrated into society. That's a great point as well. I'm just being aware of our time together. I think there's a lot to unpack in each of these, and how I like to run this particular anti-racism webinar is really picking up on the pieces that individually each of the participants have. So I will come back to each of those, but I'll just keep going on the material, and then we can come back to it. And I think a couple of those things will relate to some of those comments. So I have another question for you. Reiki, thank you. You love this idea of meeting people. That's great. I'd love to hear your stories of trying stuff out. So this is, trust me, this slide is not what you think it is. So if I present you the myth of racism, can you tell me what I'm trying to get to here? I'll give you a clue. There's been a lot of this kind of talk around the myth of racism in response or in opposition to the Black Lives Matter. You heard it on the little video clip or audio clip just now where people said, I'm tired of having to talk about this culture piece, or I'm tired of having to educate myself. What are we talking about here when I talk about the myth of racism? It's an old issue. Things have gotten better. Yes, yeah. That's one. I've got one more that I'm looking for, so let's see who can get there. Racism is not real or doesn't exist. Yes, similar to Suava's one. Anyone else? People think it's not happening? Yeah. Oh, you're all too nice, I think, because I'm not too sure how exposed you've been. Ben Shapiro has a good answer to that. Yeah, I think, Mark, you're getting to where I'm trying to get to. Exactly right. Exactly right. What I wanted to touch on with this slide and kind of that thought-provoking title is really reverse racism. Have people heard of reverse racism? Yeah, great. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about then. So when I talk about the myth of racism, I'm talking about reverse racism and the idea that we've moved past racism, as Suava and Dominic and others have mentioned, that we've moved past racism and that, you know, we're in this, I hear a lot within kind of academic and corporate diversity and inclusion circles that we'll move into a post-racial world. Personally, I think we're really far from that because we're still in primary school when it comes to having these conversations. So there is that, you know, that post-colonial, yeah, that's right, that piece of, you know, we don't have racism isn't real. And then the other side of that where people say, you know, I'm gonna reveal my political biases here, but one of our leaders of the opposition party the other day on an interview said, when asked about the lack of diversity on their front bench coming up to an election year, said, you know, I am a woman of color, the color white. Is there a problem with being white? And, you know, that kind of sentiment where people who are of the majority culture, and, you know, we can talk about racism in other cultures as well as the Western. Because in JCI Europe, I'm going to focus more on, I guess, the piece of colonialism. Sorry, I digress, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on that than talking about colorism or racism within other cultures. For now, but if you do want me to pick up on that, let me know. So the point I'm trying to make there is around reverse racism and the claims of reverse racism and, you know, that there being a problem with being white or Pākehā, which is the Māori word that we use in New Zealand. Where it comes from is discomfort, right? It's discomfort. And if you think about equity and, you know, reparations and how structurally disadvantaged certain groups have been, particularly Indigenous populations have been over time, and we are now making reparations, and that's why we have affirmative action for university entrance, affirmative action through job searches, things like that. That is making things equitable. So it might look like those groups are getting more, but that's because the majority group hasn't had to confront that privilege. And it feels like something is being taken away because they've always had the privilege not to think about that. So I always like to question, if you feel that discomfort or if you feel that defensiveness, really lean into that. Don't go the way of your Ben Shapiro's, as Mark mentioned, and get defensive, because like I said, it's that self-awareness that we initially talked about, that perspective to notice it, accept it, accept where you're coming from, accept that this is uncomfortable, accept that, these are conversations that might make you feel discomfort, and really inquire where that is coming from, because it might not come from a place where you are being discriminatory. It might come from a place where, for me, a lot of the times when I think about things being taken away from me, if I was to take that example, I think about financial security that I didn't often have growing up, for example. So just really be curious about your discomfort. And being curious means that you understand yourself better. And we're hosting this through JCI, and so your leadership becomes better. But the self-acceptance also allows you to then be more open-minded about other people and more empathetic as well. Swava, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Positive discrimination or affirmative action is racism towards white people. Exactly. That's exactly that reverse racism piece that we were talking about. I've had so many conversations in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter movement here in New Zealand, where people have tried to pitch me that, look at all the people that turned up for that march on Black Lives Matter here in New Zealand, and the Solidarity March. We're fast becoming the minority, the majority is becoming the minority, and things like that. So I'd really encourage you, whatever your background, to understand that. How does that land for people? Does that land okay? Do you have any questions? Because it might be uncomfortable to hear that perspective, and obviously my perspective is mine. Others might feel a different way, so let me know. Petra, I'm a born and bred Romanian on an island of Hungarians, German speakers, and this helped you a lot to see others' perspectives, because Transylvania is a land of cohabitation. Yet I see quite a lot of discriminatory attitudes on every side of all minorities. That is an incredible point. Like I said, I wasn't going to touch too much on, I guess, in-group racism or within, minorities are racist. I'm just going to say that. Minorities can absolutely be racist. And we do that because of our own biases as well, because everyone's got their own biases. So let me come back to that. There are a couple of other things I want to touch on. So let me come back to that in a minute, because that is quite a good point. Mark, yep, and your experience more openly. Cool. Yeah, do keep letting me how that lands for you. And okay, so I love talking about microaggressions because I have so many examples to give you. But before I give you my examples, does anyone have any examples of microaggressions? Do you know what they are? Have you experienced them? Clashing in person, walking past a person. Yep. You're very clever for a girl. Yeah, I've definitely heard that one. Jen, where are you really, really from? Exactly. Jen, I think you've heard my story around that. Scary says, Ireland, we create an entity to protect various cultures. But if you're not a citizen, you can be treated equally as a second citizen until the affirmation of citizenship. Great point. Microaggression says Irish culture. Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, Dominic. Grabbing the bag or walking quicker when a Black, Indigenous, person of color, man appears. Yeah, that's right. Oh, you speak really good Icelandic. Yeah, we get the you speak really good English. Yeah. I noticed by the way you talk that you're not a local. Yes, exactly. Yeah, quite interesting. I've heard people, what I find interesting about microaggressions, and I'm going to digress here for a little bit into a personal anecdote. What I find interesting is that people find ways to be very clever about it. And, I can see that they're being really well-intentioned and curious, and they're trying to find a way to connect as well. So one really clever personal anecdote that I'll share here is, if anyone, Dominic might recognize my accent, but if anyone does recognize a New Zealand accent, I believe that my accent is very Kiwi. I have grown up here in Auckland. Tamaki Makaurau is my home. But tell you what, I meet people sometimes and they will pick up on my accent and they won't say, oh, you speak very good English. They'll go a bit further and be a bit more clever and be like, oh, I get this. I've gotten this a few times. They're like, oh, I can hear the way that you say R is very different. Or I can hear the way that you say this particular word is very different. And I wonder where you're from because of that. And to be honest, it's just me making a mistake or how I've learned to say that word because I read more than I speak for most of my life, right? But they've immediately picked up on this thing and have just really been quite clever about it because they know that us, saying something like you speak really good English or, you've got an accent isn't quite right. So they're being quite clever about it. And so the reason I said at the start of the slide, I love talking about microaggressions is because if we're talking about really active anti-racism work, it's being quite inquiring about why you're doing something. And it's being quite curious about when things like that happen around you to say, are we just embedding racism a whole another level deeper as we get more aware of it? Does that make sense? Because I notice in New Zealand, people are a lot more aware, and you do have those people who shout from the rooftops about reverse racism. But then people start to kind of question where I can, how far can I use this particular thing and be discriminatory or use microaggressions that I might not call microaggressions or, really stuck in the othering, right? You're not being open-minded to say, hey, this person looks like this, but we are a melting pot of cultures, so we're just going to accept that they are from New Zealand or from a Western country. So that is quite interesting. I'm going to stop talking because there's lots of gold comments here, and I think that we can learn a lot from each other. So Kristen, I'm Icelandic and look like an Icelandic person, but people have been asking me over the years if I speak Icelandic. One woman said I spoke okay Icelandic. Yeah, that's an interesting point. The curiosity, because I get this that comment, very similar comments from my friends who are Pākehā or New Zealand European around, oh yes, I've been asked about my accent or I've been asked where I'm from, right? So that's a really interesting point that I want to stay on for a minute. We've got 30 minutes together, so we can power through this. That's a really interesting piece because where we talk about racism and microaggressions is questioning why someone is asking about that accent and curiosity. And I think curiosity is totally fine. I think, and I'll move on to Mark's question here. You have probably been microaggressive in the past, but in a sense that I was interested in where someone came from or get to know someone. How can you do that and not fall into the category of being microaggressive? Exactly where I was going with this. The issue comes up, and I think there's a few comments down below as well. The issue comes up with the where are you from question, for example, or the language question, for example. The issue is if I walk into a room, right, and I'll take the example of myself because I don't want to share other people's stories. But if I walk into a room, I'm there for a corporate networking event, say, as an example, and I've just walked in. I've said hello to you. I sound like this with my very Kiwi accent, as you've all validated my accent as being. And we're talking about the networking event or the topic of the networking event. We haven't touched on, the background, we're acquaintances. We haven't touched on any experiences where we're talking about, how much have you traveled? Have you lived in another country? We're not touching on any of those. We're just talking about a networking event. So in that scenario, if the second or third question, which I often get, it's usually the first question, but lately it's kind of been the second or third question is, where are you from? For me, the person is making a judgment call on my skin color because I don't present anything else to indicate that I might not be from New Zealand. They're making a judgment on my skin color to say, you must not be from New Zealand because you look different, right? And that could be a bunch of different things for other people, but, that's why that is so difficult. If someone has a very clearly German accent, for example, it might be understandable, but I can see that I am standing there with my colleague who is from the majority culture or, white presenting, and they don't get the question. So that's where I would ask the question of, what is the assumption that you have made internally that's made you ask that question in curiosity? And what is the relationship that you have with this person? Is it a relationship where you are striving towards getting to know that person deeper and finding that connection? Or have you just walked into a corporate networking event or a JCI networking event even, and you've suddenly made someone who has been asked 8 or 9 times that day, where are you from, another question that's made them feel really uncomfortable? Does that make sense? How does that land? Let me know. You can disagree with me if you like. I am quite open-minded and very happy to be challenged. Josie, sometimes you don't want other people to know that you're German, so you picked up the Kiwi accent so much that people couldn't tell at all where you're from anymore. Some thought I was a local. I'm still not sure this is a good or bad thing, actually. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think I see a lot of my friends who are migrants from European countries who don't look different from your Pākehā New Zealander or a European New Zealander, and they get accepted a lot quicker than other migrants do, even though some of my friends have been born here, for example. Reiki, talking about learn the hard way that a name does not say what language people speak. You were making a contract for someone that did not have an Icelandic name. You started talking English, and he answered back in Icelandic and never assumed what language people speak. That's a great point. I think that, thank you so much, Reiki. I think that's really what's really, really important about anti-racism work is to tell stories like that, because we don't get it right all the time. I don't get it right all the time. And it's to tell the stories about how you have made an assumption, because we are all human. We have the biases that we have from our experiences, and really say, hey, I apologized, and then I know now what assumptions I was making. People closest to you are afraid to talk about racism. We'll come back to that, to the color of your skin. I might ask you before you were curious. We've kind of covered. Suava, I'm also wondering why I feel so proud if I'm in another country and manage to disguise myself so that people think I'm from there. Very happy to assimilate and be spoken to in this native language. Unique example in Irish culture is a description. He's dyed or coloured as a description. So it is challenging. Wow. Yeah, we've had a couple of discussions. I remember in the conversation that we had in Tallinn as well, we had a couple of conversations around language and challenging language, but that can be a workshop in and of itself. Thank you. I really want to thank you all for participating and really sharing those examples. I feel like we could really have a chat for a long time, but there's a couple more slides that I want to touch on before we end, and then where I'd like to end the webinar, I guess, is talking about some of the actions, and I'd love you to share some of the actions that you feel like you could take away. And Mark, I will come back to your comment because that's one of the points I was going to make later. Okay, so the next piece there then, I'll wrap up this slide in terms of microaggressions. We've talked a lot about microaggressions. The key in microaggressions, I guess, is the idea that intentions don't matter, and that can be confronting. So let me know if you want to challenge me, please do. Intentions don't matter because we exist, as I said in this slide, we exist in a world where there is structural and institutional racism, right? And where there is structural and institutional racism, people are really materially disadvantaged, right? People are disadvantaged in the ability to get the financial security that they need. In the example I gave earlier, they're disadvantaged really tangibly in the kinds of places they can live, and the neighborhoods they can live in some countries, in a lot of countries, even in New Zealand. People are materially disadvantaged in access to education, and access to resources, and access to power. So if we think about the world where that structure exists, right? And then we think about microaggressions. What microaggressions serve to do is reinforce that structure. And that's the reason that you would challenge that, and you would challenge yourself to say, I might be curious and interested in someone's background, but what am I doing by vocalizing that thought to that person, right? It's really practicing empathy and practicing walking in other people's shoes, and practicing that understanding of racism and active anti-racism work, because it has to be broader than that moment in that context, because that person has just walked into the room with a bunch of microaggressions already having been practiced on them all day. Does that make sense for that? Does that land for you? Cool. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the comments. I really appreciate the sharing as well, because that is really important to be really open about the journey that we have. A couple of other things that I'll raise here with microaggressions before we move on. I think, Jen, you raised this about Germany and, saying, hey, there's this particular wrong that was done in our history, and so we don't want to confront it. And so there's this fear of making, being assertive about race because you find it really difficult to address that in certain contexts. So that is part of standing up and talking about it, is being able to get past that fear of making mistakes and being able to, I guess, like Reiki shared, to say, to put your hand up and say, hey, I made a mistake. I am going to correct it, and I'm going to stand up and be open about correcting it, because then you role model behavior. And I know in JCI we talk about role models and we talk about leadership, so think about that. Assuming things are better, we've talked about a little bit. Comparing oppressions. So I do want to stay on the comparing oppressions piece, because there's a couple of comments earlier around that. Comparing oppressions means that we're saying, there are people who, when I talk about racism, I immediately acknowledge my privilege that I'm university educated, I'm probably middle class, English is my first language, for example. So when I talk about racism, people say, hey, XYZ group who don't have access to financial resources are more disadvantaged, so why do you talk about racism? I talk about racism because it's all part of the same structure, and it's challenging that structural racism that we're talking about here in Germany. but also the holding that kind of idea that, I guess, you can't have intersectionality. I don't have a definition of intersectionality in these slides, but the idea that you can't, in talking about racism, you can't talk about the other marginalizations or discriminations. And the last piece, there's a bunch of things here in microaggressions, so like color blindness, stereotyping, comparing oppressions, assuming that we've moved past race, denying differences, to say we're all human, and that's denying the structural racism that exists. So the last two things that I really want to touch on, right, is defining the other. And when I say the other, it's the people or groups that you have defined as in opposition to your majority culture. And you've already walked into a room with an assumption about who they are. Like Reiki really bravely shared, you've made the assumption of the language they speak. And therefore, you've immediately removed the ability for yourself to connect as humans and really understand each other. And you've also reduced them to a fixed set of stereotypes. And the last one is approval seeking. I cannot tell you, I love my friends, most of my Pākehā friends, I love them. They allow me to rant about anti-racist work all the time. But the amount of comments and messages that I got, or Instagram posts that I got forwarded over the Black Lives Matter movement, to say, hey, Nurain, look, I know you're an anti-racist educator. Look at me, I'm doing really good. I would really challenge everyone on this webinar to think about the anti-racist work that you do, and do it because you're championing equality. Do it because you value equality. Do it because you want the opportunities to exist for everyone the same as it's existed for you. I do this work because I want to make sure that this work might impact on creating a world where opportunities are more open for my younger sister and brother, for example. Do it because you have an inner reason and an inner value. Don't do it because you're seeking approval from your marginalized friends. Don't do it because you want a pat on the back. Okay, I think that's enough for now. What I will end on is that that approval seeking piece is, you have to be careful that when you talk about anti-racism, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, research, this is a Harvard piece of research, shows that people who are from the majority culture, so say if men talk about gender equality even, or if a white person talks about racism and being anti-racist, they are rewarded for that behavior. If a woman talks about gender equality, if a brown person or a person of color talks about racism and anti-racist work, they are penalized for that behavior. So be careful about what you do and how you do your work, and really question that. Last few slides in our last 15 minutes on a very similar topic is around allyship. So if you did, and I think Swava's shared the link here around allyship, if you don't know too much about it, have a look at, have a listen to that. I think it's really important to interrogate allyship and how you do it. So over the Black Lives Matter moment, yeah, that's a great point, Swava. You noticed that all the BIPOC people that you follow had bombarded with messages. Absolutely. It's a really interesting one. Maria JCF Frankfurt being discussed racism with police officers, but denies racism exists for the military. I've got an interesting story on the police in New Zealand, but I know that we have to finish up in about 15 minutes, so we'll keep going. So performative allyship, Swava, you've said you noticed that. Has anyone else noticed this happening? There's a couple of things I want to touch on. So virtue signaling and white fragility, as well as centering yourself. Any comments on that, whether you noticed that, how you noticed that, where it is coming from. Jen, you've noticed that, yeah. So if you do end up going and having a listen to my earlier webinar on allyship, I'll touch on the centering yourself piece here. Centering yourself is the idea that in anti-racist work or in allyship, you talk about what you're supposed to be doing. So, I am a part of a nonprofit group where we're talking about how we can be better allies for the communities that we serve. And the conversation is so much centered on themselves and how they can be allies rather than how can we structurally think about what we're doing. So other following activists, but then tone policing their personal accounts. They're too angry, too militant, too whatever. That's a great point. Absolutely. Yeah. Rachel, I've been mindful when reaching out to people of color to ask for input and ask at what cost. That's really great. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to value the work that we do and to value the work that we do in speaking up about this, because it is emotional labor for us. So we've touched on, I haven't called it white fragility, but we've touched on that discomfort and the denial that comes with it and leaning into that. We've touched on you're benefiting, virtue signaling we've touched on, kind of to say, hey, look, I'm doing this. You only say something because you were called out, not because you're continuing to do the work. And bandwagoning. The reason I was so excited to do this webinar, and thank you again, Reiki, Swava, and Jen for inviting me to do it, was because, the hashtags have stopped trending now. And, there is still a little bit of, noise around Black Lives Matter, around racism, but it really feels, I was in this moment where it was blowing up around the world and in New Zealand, and it was everywhere in all of our main newspapers. People who didn't talk about it blacked out their Instagram profile. And to be quite honest, as an anti-racism activist, but also as someone who experienced racism, it made me quite angry because, where I was coming from was that all of my friends who experience racism, all of the young people that I mentor who experience racism, the hashtag, when it goes away, we still are left with the costs of racism. So that's why performative allyship isn't just, it isn't just about you and it exists in a vacuum. It does impact people because you've said this thing, but then you've almost taken the momentum out of the movement by not then moving to authentic action. Cool. Jen, criticism can only come in one particular way. Yeah, very polite and calm. And then if not, the feedback is invalid. It is hard to talk about racism. Absolutely. Yeah, I really agree with that. I think if you can allow yourself to feel that discomfort and listen, that's one way. But it is difficult. So this is my last slide, and then we can have a bit of a chat as we end. So when we're talking about moving away from performative allyship, what do? Sitting with discomfort. I heard a lot of empathy, grief, and outrage from my friends. I have done diversity and inclusion training programs at work, in a corporate environment before where, your senior executive leader who is an older white Pākehā and NZ European man has cried because they've heard me talk about the experience of racism. And it's okay to express grief. It's okay to sit with empathy and outrage. be mindful about centering yourself and not the people who are being marginalized. Be mindful that it's not about you, it's about the marginalization. And there might be people on this webinar who are experiencing racism, and in that case, process that for yourself as well. Take real action. So taking real action means that you are considering those 3 levels of racism that I talked about in every space that you go into. And I do acknowledge, we've said it is difficult. It is difficult if you might not be the most senior person and you might not have the power, but consider the little actions that you might take to challenge something someone says. Whether it's your racist uncle or auntie that I've heard of, that we all have regardless of culture, because the older generation might be more stuck in their perspective. Just to say, hey, that's not okay. And if that's all you can do that day, that's enough. Educating yourself is the key to anti-racist work. Educate yourself by doing what I told you before, expand that perspective, read, expand your friend circle through shared interests, and be committed to anti-racist work and make sure that you're taking risks and holding yourself and others accountable, because anti-racism work is really, it is so difficult because it's uncomfortable. It's not everyday conversation. So make sure that if you are putting yourself up as an ally, as an authentic ally, if you are standing up and saying, I want to do this work, I like to think about it as saying we're in the trenches together. I get microaggressions all day, every day, and sometimes I get overt racism, particularly in this time where it is a difficult time where people are beginning to feel a bit of the discomfort and therefore they're being defensive. We're in the trenches together, so if you hear someone say something about a friend, stand up and put yourself in the line of fire, and say, hey, I don't think that's all right. So please, let's not do that. And you might get a bad reaction, and that's what we're saying by take risks, and hold yourself accountable to that, because that is about putting yourself out there and saying to a racist comment, that's not fine. I don't accept that, and this is an environment where we can create a safer space. And if you get a bad reaction, please don't back away. Be courageous, but again, acknowledging that you can have spaces where you have power and you might not. Educate yourself. I did something last year where I was really quite tired and exhausted of talking about anti-racism in my daily life, and I would come home and go to my entertainment, whether that's a book or a podcast or a movie, and I decided I didn't want to experience microaggressions through my entertainment. So I had a year last year of consuming content, movies, books, podcasts that were made or starring people of color, and it was really quite interesting because that expands your perspective as well. Examine your own privilege and really leverage that to help. I have been privileged enough to be given a platform where I can speak. So I use this platform to do work like this. Think about your privilege. You might, you might be an artist, say. I keep bringing up the creativity because I'm in finance, so that's the furthest thing from me that I can think of. But you might be an artist, say, and you might be doing concerts or live gigs. You might invite someone who is a Black Indigenous person of color to join you. You might reach out to venues that work with those communities, for example. Think about your strengths and what privilege and power you have, and leverage that to use to help others. This one is the biggest one that I want to leave you with. sit with that discomfort, notice it, and accept it. Be compassionate about yourself, because as we always say, it's not your first thought that counts, it's your second, because the first one is what's been programmed to you through your experiences and how we've been raised. It's the second one where you are taking action and conscious action from. So be self-compassionate, but lean into that discomfort. Swava has said it exactly right. When we do active allyship, we make mistakes, and accept those mistakes, and allow yourself to be brave about owning those mistakes. Because, to be honest, people like me who do experience racism, and probably others who experience worse racism, need you to use your privilege and do it. Petra's got a great suggestion. Get out and do volunteering with people from other groups, and you'll immediately shift a perspective. And that's why JCI is so great, because we're all connected. That's great. Thank you. I will leave you with these key takeaway messages. I've talked a lot this early in the morning in New Zealand, but I hope you've taken some tangible tips away. I really wanted this webinar to be about unpacking some of what's going on for us, unpacking where we're sitting with different things, and really starting to think a bit deeper about where we are. So first step, understanding and acceptance. Where are your biases? What are you thinking about? Why? What's your first thought? And then how do you accept that, acknowledge that, have kindness on yourself that we're all on this journey, but you're committed to this work. And then doing the work. Remember, self-compassion and acceptance and kindness is important, but also doing the work and putting yourself out there and taking the risk is also important. Speaking up across all levels is key, right? You can be the best friend to your network in your community. You can be the most inclusive person, that person who authentically connects with everyone regardless of color or background or whatever. But if we are not challenging those structural issues, if we are not stepping up and challenging, if we see a pay gap, if we see someone at a shop not being served, if we see something occurring and we're not challenging that structural issue, then we're not doing the work. We're not being anti-racist. And the last piece of anti-racism, and we haven't really gone too deep into this because this is I guess this is an introductory piece of unpacking, is that if you're committed to anti-racism and authentic allyship, we have to do the systemic activism. So absolutely turn up to marches, turn up to speaking events, but also make sure that if you see companies that are being racist or don't have inclusive policies, you write to them, you speak to them, or you boycott them. Take actions like that where you are really being active about the work. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left, I think. So if you could please pop in the chat some of your takeaways, some other comments that you'd like to say. If you're curious about it, please do go on to the webinar from JCI Manchester on the 30th of July. Let's keep doing the work. Let's build that momentum. I'd love to see you there. Dominic, recently a nominee for mayor, removed himself as he lost support in relation to racism. Yeah, people do learn that actions do have consequences, absolutely, but obviously that was based on the fact that there were some anti-racists that were actually doing that work. So yeah, let's make sure that people are aware. Yeah, I'd love to hear one word or two words, just a key takeaway of what you took out of this and how you're leaving this webinar feeling. I hope that that was useful, and very happy to share anything or have a chat to anyone individually. Cool. Thank you, Raiki and Swava, for and Jen as well for organising and kind of being behind the scenes of this. It's been really great to be able to share this perspective. And I just want to shout out again to Dominic. Really great to see another Kiwi or someone with a Māori ancestry over in this webinar as well, all the way across the world. So that's been nice. Great, awesome, really great. Yeah, I do hope you take 1 or 2 things away, so that would be really good. Swava, thank you for being brave and owning that. Mark, yeah, try harder to change your point of view. Yeah, challenge your point of view. That's really good. It is really uncomfortable when you are also a minority. And yeah, that's exactly right. No problem. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn, Instagram, LinkedIn, whichever is easier for you. I'm very happy to take any questions. I'm being open about it and offering this as part of this training, so don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you, Mark. Good night to you. It's going to be a start of the day for me, so that would be good. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening for me to half an hour. Usually I hear other voices, so that's great. Cool, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, absolutely do reach out to me. Thank you all for your comments, and enjoy your weekends. Kia kaha. Thank you, Josie. Really lovely to see you again as well.
Thank you everyone for participating for this webinar. We are soon going to advertise the next webinars, who will be in August and September. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening or a good day.